Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David French, it's good to be back with you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I wish we had more enjoyable topics to cover today.
Yeesh, I know.
But it's been a rough couple weeks for sure. Obviously, the country has been talking about the shocking and yet not entirely surprising school shooting that happened in Texas last week. We're recording this 7 days after the event. We have some more insight into what actually occurred, some of the response from the police or lack of response. There's criticism all over the place. You've written and spoken about this. I've been kind of keeping track of that over the last couple of days. I want to begin with this issue, which you've talked about for a long time, which is red flag laws.
Yeah.
And you seem to believe that that is a significant and underutilized tool that we have to combat these kinds of things from happening. Just simply explain what are red flag laws.
So a red flag law, the best comparison for a red flag law is like a domestic violence restraining order. You know how if somebody is stalking or threatening a family, you can get an order requiring them to stay away, requiring even like a husband to stay away from a wife, a father to stay away from kids. What a red flag law does is something similar, except what if someone is engaging in threatening or menacing behavior, you can go to court and you can get an order requiring them to surrender their weapons. And if they don't surrender their weapons, then the police can go get their weapons. And the reason for this as an idea is that we now have, Skye, this is sad to say, the National Institute for Justice funded a study of 50 years of mass shootings. So think about that. We've had 50 years of mass shootings to study now. And what they found was that in most cases, the shooter leaked his plans. In other words, they said something to the effect of describing what they were going to do. In many other cases, even beyond where they leaked their plans, they engaged in incredibly threatening and irresponsible behavior in other circumstances. Like the Uvalde shooter was somebody who would allegedly go out with a BB gun shooting people, who had cut his face up just for fun. The police had been repeatedly called to his home. So this is something that with a red flag law, if you see somebody who is engaging in really aberrant behavior and threatening and menacing behavior, you can petition a court and a court can get an order seizing their weapons. And it can be family members, it could be school officials, it can be police. But it's really something that's tailored to this issue of people who are broadcasting their threatening intentions. And it's also applicable to people who are broadcasting, suicidal ideation, that you can go in and seize guns from the home of somebody who's having a suicidal crisis. And so it's really designed to deal with people who are, by their behavior, indicating they have no business owning a gun.
So I know that the laws differ from state to state. There's not like a universal federal red flag law. Do these laws typically also prevent somebody who doesn't own a gun from purchasing one? Are they put on a register?
Yes. So they not only can't possess a gun, and if they have a gun, it's taken, they can't then purchase one as well while that order is in place.
So two questions about the red flag law thing. It's my understanding that there are currently red flag laws in some form or another in 19 states and DC.
Yes.
Only one of those is a red state, and that's Florida.
Yeah, Florida.
Why is this apparently a politicized matter? Why is it only blue states that have these laws in place? And what is the obstacle in red states that these aren't happening?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, some people will jump up and say, wait, there's one in Indiana, and Indiana's a red state. But I was going by state control, not by who votes, the presidential vote. I was going by state control, and Indiana has a divided legislature. The reason is really pretty simple. After Parkland, now red flag laws are a relatively recent innovation in this debate. And after Parkland, it seemed that there was going to be some real momentum on a bipartisan basis. After all, Florida passed, after Parkland, a red flag law and also passed a law raising the age to purchase a rifle to 21. And Trump indicated he supported red flag laws. There's even, I think, it may be taken down since, but in 2018, the NRA even did a video saying it was open to red flag laws. Marco Rubio had introduced red flag legislation. Governor Abbott said he was interested in Texas and red flag laws. Governor Ducey in Arizona put together a safe schools plan that had something called a STOP order, a severe threat order of protection. And then, the core gun rights grassroots got involved in the debate and really knocked the legs out from under it.
And what's their argument? Why do they see this as somehow an infringement on the Second Amendment or their rights to own a gun?
So there's a couple arguments. One bad, one better. Okay. The bad argument is that this is sort of punishing someone before they commit a crime. That's why I brought up the domestic violence restraining order concept. I mean, if you're going to say that you cannot restrain somebody from constitutionally protected activity on the basis of their behavior, what do you have to say about domestic violence restraining orders? In those circumstances, I have a constitutional interest in raising my own children, right? This is something that's a core constitutional interest. And yet I can be barred from even being in the physical presence of my children based on my threatening behavior.
Right.
So that's the bad argument. The better argument is that red flag laws may not have, any given red flag law may not have sufficient due process protections. In other words, if maybe the burdens of proof are too low, or when you go to court for an ex parte order where you're able to go to court and get a seizure before you even give notice to the gun owner, that maybe there's too long between the seizure and a hearing. Those are kinds of technical objections that a well-drafted red flag law should be able to deal with. And though, a due process objection is a legitimate objection. And so it's not just that you want to draft anything and throw it on a page. It should have careful due process protections, a limited time period for the order in which it has to be renewed with presentation of evidence, for example. But those objections should be in even a decently drafted law should be able to overcome those objections.
Okay, so those are the explicit objections that I assume you're hearing. What do you think's the real objection to these laws in red states?
A lot of it is just any gun regulation is letting sort of like it's getting the foot in the door, right? It's like the camel's nose under the tent. It's a slippery slope argument. And then some people say it's just going to be abused. In other words, if you buy a gun and you put on Instagram that you bought a gun, then somebody's going to seek a red flag order against you. Well, that's where due process comes in. You have to have evidence, and the evidence has to be more than I own a gun to get an order. But I do think a lot of it is there's this sort of reflexive response that says that there are certain specific go-tos, like, we'll enforce existing gun laws before you pass a new gun law, or we need to try hardening schools before we limit gun rights. We need, so there's sort of, we need to revamp the mental health system before we consider new gun regulation. So there's a lot of sort of standbys. And my objection to those standbys is, look, we know what these mass shootings are now. This is a known phenomenon to us. This is not something that's a mystery anymore. And when you have the amount of evidence that we have that these killers are constantly broadcasting that they're dangerous, and you have a legal tool that is designed exactly to deal with people who are broadcasting that they're dangerous, I'm sure, let's rethink school security. Sure, we absolutely need better mental health care in this country. But it's a lot more attainable, targetable remedy right now in the short term is a red flag law. It just puts a new tool in law enforcement's hands, families' hands, schools' hands.
As you've pointed out in other places, obviously these mass shootings, particularly these horrific ones like Sandy Hook and now Uvalde, these are, statistically speaking, they're incredibly tiny fraction of gun deaths in America, but they grab our attention. They're very traumatic for the country. But it seems like a red flag law would go a long way to help where the majority of gun deaths come from, which is
Suicide.
suicide and domestic violence.
Hmm.
So, yeah, hardening schools, these other things, they're fine, but you're not talking about something that's going to really move the needle on gun deaths in America the way that a red flag law, an effective red flag law, might really save lives where gun deaths are most common. Okay, this is an unfair question. I'm going to say that up front because I know you have a difficult time not going to the constitutional law attorney kind of mindset, due process, all of that.
Right.
But if it's possible to turn off that part of your brain, and
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know
We'll
either,
see.
and just keep the Christian ethics side of the brain going. If you are advocating that we should allow the government to take away firearms from people who are showing signs of mental illness or aggression or broadcasting their intent to do harm, why not make it a prerequisite to get a gun that you have a psych evaluation or training or some kind of licensing to prove that you are a responsible adult with a firearm before getting one in the first place? Isn't that the more ethically responsible position for a society to hold?
Okay, I would say if you move down to year zero, where there are no guns, you've got a situation where you have either very few or a very limited number of guns, and you're trying to introduce from the beginning of your society and your culture, what is the process for introducing guns into this society? Then I might have a lot more sympathy for that idea that sort of says, wait a minute, you need to, in the same way that you have to pass a test to get a driver's license, for
Right,
example,
exactly.
that there is. So I don't think there's an inherent ethical issue with asking someone to demonstrate that they have a degree of responsibility. And in fact, we do have a very slim version of that, which is passing a background check, right? And if you get a handgun permit in many cases, you have to, in many states, not all states, you have to go through a class and all of that. But so if you're starting from a year zero perspective, I don't think there's an inherent problem with that at all, and there's a lot to commend it. I think one of the issues that you have here is we're not at a year zero perspective. We're at a 400 million guns are in circulation perspective, and you have an inherent human right of self-defense. So one of the issues that I have when we talk about guns and gun control, and I come at this and I'll, just really admit where I come from out of this. We come from this perspective as a family who's faced a series of very serious threats over the last 7 years of our lives. And so we have to think about our security. And we've had to think a lot about our security. And one of the things that I think about is if somebody comes to our house, it's odds of them being sort of a cat burglar, like somebody wants to come and grab some jewelry and dash out. It's lower. It's much more likely somebody who comes to our house is actively going to want to try to hurt us. And if they come to our house and they're going to try to hurt us, they're going to usually have either a semi-automatic rifle or a semi-automatic pistol. And in that circumstance, that inherent right of self-defense to be meaningful has to be effective. And so I think that if you're going to say to somebody who in a nation and a culture awash with guns, who's got an issue with a boyfriend, who's got an issue with an ex-boyfriend, who's got an issue in their neighborhood, to say you're going to have to go through a multi-week process, at which point you're not really going to be able to exercise a right of self-defense in a meaningful way, I think that that's a real problem.
Okay, but I mean, the argument that we have 400 million guns flooding our society, therefore we can't really regulate them the way we should have from the beginning. My children entered into a world where there were millions and millions of automobiles. And an automobile, especially where we live in the suburbs, it's a necessary tool in order to fully engage in young adult life, whether it's having a job after school, even getting to school. Like an automobile is a necessity, and yet we still regulate it. we still ask young people to demonstrate a level of proficiency and responsibility before the state says, okay, we believe you are minimally required to operate this vehicle in society safely. So this 18-year-old who shot up this school in Texas was, from what I can tell, exhibiting significant mental health issues.
Right.
And yet there was no expectation or requirement that this young man go through any kind of evaluation before he could walk into a store and buy multiple firearms and armor. And had there been those kinds of checks, he probably would have been prevented from purchasing those weapons. So I still don't understand the argument. And there's very, very few cases where I need to have a gun right now to defend myself. And we don't do that with any other lethal objects or any other critical components. But because there's a Second Amendment, we say to people, the government can't infringe on this, when that doesn't hold up in other cases.
Well, but we have a tool that we can pull off the shelf to deal with that young man. The red flag law. He would have qualified.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that with automobiles and say to a 16-year-old, here's the keys. We're not going to take it away from you until you exhibit bad behavior with it.
Well, if you look at, so the issue here, you have to look at where do gun deaths come from? Okay. As a general matter, they're coming in three buckets. One is what you would call common crime, whether it's street crime or domestic violence. In that circumstance, there's an overwhelming tendency for a person who uses a gun in sort of the normal criminal context, that they don't have it legally. They don't possess it legally. They didn't get it legally. So in that circumstance, what you're describing is a process that's not relevant to the common crime issue.
Right.
Okay. On the second issue, on the suicide issue, there's no real indication that we have, there's no real data that I'm aware of that says that people impulse buy guns to commit suicide, that somebody who's radiating suicidal ideation buys a gun to commit suicide. I'm sure it happens in some circumstances, but that's not sort of your typical suicide situation. And then the third category, which is this very, very small fraction of gun deaths, but extremely painful for the country, are what we were just talking about. So my issue on regulation, and then there's this other group of people who legally buy guns, law-abiding citizens who legally buy guns, who pass a background check. If they carry, they go through the class, etc. In that circumstance, their rate of gun crime is super, super, super low. And so my view on regulation, and this is, one of the things that I think about all the time on any front, if you're talking about regulating anything, define your problem and aim your regulation at the problem. And, and so is the problem that we have, is the real problem that we have, that once people who obtain guns legally are using them at scale to commit crime. It's not really the problem we have.
I'm not talking about crime. It's certainly a factor. I'm talking about gun deaths, of which, you're right, the most significant number are suicide. And I think you're also correct that most people who have suicidal ideation probably don't walk into a Walmart and say, give me a gun because I want to kill myself tonight. They probably already have that weapon. So why then? I mean, when it comes to the automobile or driving, I have to, with some regularity, go back into the state and re-verify that I continue to have the skills and capacity to operate an automobile. I have to get my eyes checked by the state regularly. My parents who are aging, as they age, they have to more frequently prove that they can drive an automobile. Why not have a system where if you're a gun owner, I don't know, pick the regularity, 24 months, 36 months, you have to have a psych evaluation to continue to possess your weapons. Ooh, right now, the red flag law would say you can only have those removed if someone else believes you are at risk and they flag you. Why don't we do that preemptively? Evaluations on people. So
the problem I have with the psych evaluation is it's extremely subjective. Extremely. So the issue, if you're talking about eyesight is a much more objective thing. Either you can see letters or you can't see letters. But A psych evaluation is an extremely subjective enterprise, and when you put a fundamental right up for a psych evaluation, your ability to exercise a fundamental right up for a psych evaluation, that's extremely, extremely problematic. One of the issues that we have seen, for example, we actually do have some sort of laboratories of when you make the ability to carry a weapon subject to the subjective assessment of a governmental entity. The record is pretty gruesome as far as the favoritism and abuse that sneaks in. So let's take, for example, there's a Supreme Court case that's New York State Rifle and Pistol Association case that's pending before the Supreme Court right now. So in New York City, if you want to carry a weapon outside the home, you've got to sort of you have to prove a need. You have to prove that, it's not just that you pass a background check or all of this other stuff. You have to prove that you need it. Well, guess who turns out to really need these things? Celebrities, people who are connected to,
Sure.
So subjective evaluations for the exercise of fundamental liberties, I think, is a very, very bad idea.
But isn't the red flag law a subjective evaluation?
But it's not a permanent deprivation. So number one, you're going to use existing legal criteria to establish, for example, what a threat is. And then you're going to have a due process, and you're going to have a temporary seizure unless it can be renewed. And again, we have, but what you're talking about is before any person can exercise a right at all, they would have to pass through a subjective evaluative process. And
that's why I prefaced it with put your constitutional law thing aside. Yeah. It's just, wouldn't that, from a Christian ethical point of view, wouldn't that be a better society than the one we currently have?
No, because a Christian ethical point of view understands the fallibility and the propensity towards those in power to abuse their power. So and
it also affirms the fallibility and the likelihood of those who possess lethal weapons to also potentially use them. So which side would you rather err on?
Oh, I'm absolutely not going to err on the side of my individual ability to defend my life to be up to the subjective assessment of another person.
But the fact that you feel you need that power to defend your life is because we have a society in which we don't regulate guns much at all. It's a circular argument.
Right. But I mean, I don't like to have arguments based on societies that don't exist. So, or I don't like to have an argument about American policy based on an America that doesn't exist. Now, there are societies that do exist where gun ownership is extremely rare, and the level of safety that you have in that society is something that the introduction of large-scale privately owned firearms, private ownership of firearms at a large scale could upset that. That's a different country than this country. Well, and I just can't get past the idea that nothing that is being proposed would have a material impact on the threat that I could conceivably face. And so in that circumstance, we have to deal with the society that we have, not the society that we wish we had.
Then let's do that. Let's talk about the society that we have. The CDC has come out with a report based on numbers from 2020 that shows that guns are now the leading cause of death for all children in the United States. More than cars, more than drug abuse. So that's the America we now have. If that's the case, if children die from guns more than anything else in this country, what do we do about that? Is that an acceptable reality for America?
Well, number one, the level of gun death we have is not acceptable. Number two, that study is not of just children. And I don't know why we have had these headlines after headlines saying they're the leading cause of death of children. It's for age 1 to 19.
Okay, let's shave off 19. 1 to 18,
Right.
the legal.
Well, 18, legal
Okay.
adult, 18. So if you're 1 to 17, then it's no longer true.
Okay, well, let's compare apples to apples because in the
Mhm.
CDC study, they said before 2020, the leading cause for all Americans aged 0 to 19 was cars.
Mhm.
It is now guns.
Mhm.
That has changed. That is
Right.
a shift in mortality of people under the age of 19 in the United States. That's just a fact.
Mhm.
So is that the society we want? And if it isn't, what can we do about it?
Oh, it's absolutely not the society we want. But one of the things that I'm consistently asking people who say, I have a proposal that deals with gun regulation to change that society, um, is the proposal that you want to enact, is it one that will in fact change that reality? Now, and the other thing is, um, there are some sweeping proposals that would require a repeal of the Second Amendment, and for that matter, maybe some rethinking of the Ninth and 10th Amendment that are completely off the table, like just completely off the table. So, for
Why?
example,
I mean,
um,
we are at a moment where it's looking increasingly likely after 50 years that the Supreme Court may overturn the constitutional right to an abortion. We have also amended the Constitution dozens of times in the history of this country,
mhm,
sometimes to undo original evils in the Constitution, like slavery. If if we now are in a country with 400 million guns, and we are seeing that for the first time in our history, guns are the leading cause of death for young people in this country. Thinking about the automobile for a second. For a very, very long time, automobile crashes were the leading cause of death for young people. We have dramatically changed, both through technology and legislation, the safety of our cars. There has been a concerted effort to do that. Even since I was a 16-year-old, in my
mhm,
state, I have seen the laws change. Seatbelt laws were put into effect. We required child safety seats for infants and toddlers. When my children got their driver's license, they had to do, I don't know, I think it's 50 hours of driving before they could get their license. That was not a requirement when I got mine. And then for the first year they have their license, they're only allowed to have one other non-family member in the car with them. All these were cautions and precautions put into effect to try to keep young people safe. And it's worked. Why don't we see that kind of concerted effort around gun safety in this country if it's the leading cause of death for young people? And why are so many Americans opposed to even common sense things like red flag laws if it could do something to change this trajectory?
well, we have to talk about the difference between like a red flag law versus a psych evaluation to own a gun. Those are two
Well,
very.
I'm saying
There's a huge.
I don't see why anything should be off the table, including amending the Constitution. If it's really, I mean, from a Christian point of view, if this is a scourge on our society, why don't we take dramatic action to try to change it?
Yeah. So the question is, I don't think that people are saying that we shouldn't take action to change it. I think the question is, what action can we take that is consistent with the inherent human right of self-defense that can make a difference? And what we've seen is the number of gun deaths, for example, violent crime in the U.S., has decreased very dramatically in the past, even as restrictions against private gun ownership have eased. So, there's not necessarily, Skye, a situation where you can say, okay, if you have more guns in circulation, that means we're going to have more gun deaths.
Well,
The
but there are. We
factor,
know the states that have the most guns have the most gun deaths. It's not always criminal gun deaths. It includes suicides.
yes, absolutely. But the difference is that when you're talking about gun deaths in the U.S., the fact of the matter is we've been able to reduce them, especially in the criminal context, without while in the same time, multiple states, almost every state in the union has actually made it easier to purchase a gun. It's not a one-to-one relationship. The other thing is that you often see is that this idea that if you decrease gun suicides, you're going to decrease suicides. It's not, that's assuming facts, not in evidence as well. Some of the highest suicide nations in the world have almost no guns present in the society. And so, the issue here is suicides. The issue here is criminality, deaths is murder. So you have suicide, you have murder, and you have these mass killings. What's going to decrease murder? What's going to decrease suicide? What's going to decrease mass killings? And there's going to be different answers for these different things. And what a lot of people do is they say, well, it's got to be the access to guns. But we know that the access to guns doesn't necessarily mean that the murder rate goes up or down. It's access to guns doesn't necessarily mean that suicide goes up or down. It's very, very complicated. But one thing that we, that we do know is that there are many other kinds and forms of intervention that do have a real bearing on things like criminality, on suicide, on mass shootings. And so the problem that I have is I completely agree that this is unacceptable. I don't agree that things that have not been proven to impact each one of the buckets of deaths are the answer.
I think we could agree that in all those buckets, there are multiple factors. One factor that's common in all of them, though, is guns. And so why is that one piece not allowed to be part of the conversation in prevention? And when it comes
it's always a part of the conversation.
When it comes to suicide, you're right. There are countries that don't have many guns that have very high rates of suicide. The difference is, in having been a pastor, having been a hospital chaplain, having been in the room of people who have attempted suicide, one thing that's clear is most suicide attempts fail, which gives the opportunity to intervene and get that person help, unless the first attempt is with a gun. Guns are the most lethal and successful form of suicide that we know of. A person who tries to commit suicide with a gun is usually successful the first time. It doesn't allow a second chance. So that's what it comes down to. Same thing. If we magically got rid of guns in this country, would it prevent anybody who's mentally ill from going into a school and harming kids? No, it wouldn't. We've seen other countries where people have attempted that with knives. The issue is not, does it solve the problem? We're trying to create less lethal encounters, whether it's suicide or a school attack, whatever it might be. And these weapons are particularly lethal. That's what they're designed to be. And so when I think about the pro-life movement, for example, and the work that they've done over the last 50 years, there have been mitigations on all number of levels. And you've been a great advocate for this and an outspoken voice in it, saying, yeah, we need to think about Roe v. Wade and Casey and the Supreme Court, but we need boots on the ground interventions too. We need legal state level interventions in municipalities and funding for different things that have been proven to mitigate the need for abortion. And, it's a full kind of all hands on deck approach to solving what is a life issue. And similarly, I don't understand why for certain segments, especially within the church, they're willing to have those conversations around mental health, suicide, crime, mass shootings, but they don't ever want to talk about the gun piece of this. Why is that not allowed to be on the table?
I think it's always allowed to talk about. I think one of the frustrations you have in the gun conversation is that often what ends up happening is you have people parachuting into the conversation and they have a lot of feelings about the situation and they don't have a lot of knowledge about it. And so, this is one of the things I constantly find myself in the position of doing is explaining to people, some of the basics of gun crime, how people get a hold of their guns, some of the basics surrounding the suicide. For example, in Australia, they had this mandatory, they implemented dramatic restrictions on gun ownership after a mass shooting in Australia. And suicides just kept going up. Up and up, even after the gun, dramatic restrictions on ownerships of guns. And so a lot of times I think what ends up happening is we say, I want to do something about X. And then what we can't do is the next thing to say, and if you also want to do something about X, but you're opposed to my prescription to deal with X, then you're not really serious about dealing with X. Whereas in the gun control conversation, I get that a lot because people say, well, don't you want to do something about suicides? And I'll say, yeah, I want to do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G that I think will really reduce suicides. And then you say, but what about the thing that I don't believe will reduce suicides? Aren't you in favor of that? And I say, no, because I don't think that will reduce suicides. And it will also have the effect of infringing on other values that are important. Well, so I guess part of it is you just kind of get at a bit of a loss because there's a lot of feelings that people have that they say, I really feel like this would matter. And then there isn't the data to necessarily say it will matter. And so you say, well, wait, I'm not sure that's going to matter. But it feels like it would. I'm not so sure that it would. And so I think that that's one of the problems you have in the gun violence debate. It's funny because you'll have, a lot of people will want gun control, for example, but they won't want more cops on the streets because that raises the specter of mass incarceration, or that raises the specter of police brutality. And they say, well, we have to take the more cops on the streets piece off of it and deal with the gun. Well, wait a minute. Wait, what are we trying to get at here? What is the thing that we're trying to do? And if you're looking at each one of these three things, there are variables at work that are much more impactful, that are potential than the whatever gun regulation is floated.
Well, I agree, but again, when I think about the abortion case, there are people out there who will say, "Hey, let's get better healthcare access. Let's change welfare policies. Let's improve education in areas where it's poor. Let's give more economic opportunity in poor communities where abortion rates are high. But don't you dare touch Roe v. Wade. You can't do that. That's off limits." We would both agree that's ridiculous. Like, when it comes to reducing the number of abortions, let's look at every option available to us: legal, economic, social, cultural, ecclesiastical, whatever it might be. And when it comes to gun deaths in America, I don't understand. I'm in favor of, let's explore what policing needs to change, what capacities need to change, what needs to change around culture. Here's another one that when I've brought it up with other gun rights advocates, they kind of lose their minds over. I may not have the legal details correct here, so put me in the right direction. There have been proposals in the past to put laws in place to say that if your gun is used in a criminal offense, you are liable for that gun. Meaning because you did not secure it. It isn't like you were beaten down and somebody took the gun off of your hip, right? No, you didn't secure the gun in your home or in some way, and it ended up being used. Think of the Sandy Hook shooter. He took guns from, I believe, his parents' home and used those in that terrible shooting at the elementary school. So if you are irresponsible with the securing of your firearms and they end up in the wrong hands and used in a criminal way, you are liable for it. It seems to me like that would create an environment in which more gun owners would be like, I need to be really responsible and secure with these weapons because I don't want to find myself in that situation. And yet that kind of legislation is also opposed by gun owners.
I don't have any problem with that kind of legislation that says there are. So if you tie legislation to responsibility of the exercise of your rights, then for example, you can lose a driver's license for reckless driving.
Exactly.
Right. So if you tie it to irresponsible exercise or to actual evidence of threat, actual evidence, then, I don't have a problem with that. The problem that I have is when you say, in a context, see, the difference between abortion and gun rights is that abortion is not rooted in any explicit constitutional liberty. It's not rooted in the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution. It's not rooted in the history it's not rooted in the history of American morality. It's not rooted in the history of American law. It is something completely concocted by the court in 1973. So it's a poor comparison, because if you're talking about the inherent right of the right to bear arms is connected to an inherent right of self-defense, and so you've got text history and tradition, you've got American history and tradition, you've got this is part of the bundle. The ability to defend yourself and your family from a threat is kind of part of the bundle of rights that human beings inherently possess, and so they're not quite the same comparison. So if I'm talking about something where I have it connects with that bundle of rights that I inherently possess, yeah, I can be deprived of that right because of my irresponsibility or my criminality, and regulations that are tied to irresponsibility or criminality, I think are can be really valuable. But to sort of condition to try to deprive somebody of that sort of inherent right in this country, I think is very problematic.
We had this conversation a couple of years ago. For those of you who want to go back and listen to it, it was episode 423, about the history of gun rights and self-defense and things like that. I don't want to speak for the pro-choice side of this because I don't have their arguments as internalized as they would, but a pro-choice advocate would disagree with you on not having a constitutional right to abortion because they would see it as inherent to a woman choosing to do with her own body what she wants, the right of privacy. And that's obviously been the big debate in the Supreme Court and with that leaked opinion. But I don't disagree with the history or even the constitutional right of self-defense. But when you push that individual right to the degree that you've now created a more dangerous society for everybody, where the leading cause of death is now guns among people under 19 years old, it's similar to saying, like, can the government force me to put a mask on my face during a global pandemic? Don't I have bodily autonomy to not wear a mask? Well, there is a public health concern here. I would argue there's a public health concern with 400 million guns floating around our society. And so, as in so many cases, individual rights do come up against the tension with public rights and public safety. And the fact that we have 400 million guns, at some point, do we enter into this, during the Cold War, we talked about mutually assured destruction, where we needed to keep building massive weapons that could destroy the planet because the Soviets were doing the same thing. And so we just ramped up. At some point, you cross a threshold of deterrence, and now you just get into complete madness. And as a society, have we gone from deterrence to this is no longer acceptable because the public health cost is too high?
Well, but again, if you're talking about masks and bodily autonomy, you're talking about something that's not connected to, I don't have the ability to walk into Cracker Barrel nude, right? Like that. Nobody would say that's not a constitutional right. We have to get the difference between a desire. I desire not to have a mask on my face versus a right. Those are not the same thing. Okay. And so that was one of the things about the masking debate, or for that matter, vaccine debates, is these are individuals who are wading into a debate over something that they called a right. Well, where were they getting the idea was a right? So not everything I want in my life is a right. Okay. I don't have a right to the things that I want to do. What are rights? Things that you have a liberty to exercise against government control under, not in all circumstances, but in many, or if not most circumstances. That's a much more narrower enumerated set of values.
Sure. But in the unenumerated category, shouldn't school children have a right to not have to fear mass shootings in school? Shouldn't we have a right to live in a society where kids are not having to do active shooter drills in their schools quarterly or monthly or whatever it might be? Like at some point, doesn't the rights of individuals within society to live in the expectation of relative safety trump the individual right to have an AR-15 or to display it and carry it openly? Or
I guess the thing
what's the balance here?
The loggerheads we're at is that we have a lot of research and knowledge about, for example, there was an assault weapon ban for a period of time in the United States. It didn't have a material effect on crime. So I think that the problem is when you're focusing on the guns, you're often actually not focusing on the things that will change the circumstances on the ground. And I know this is very hard for a lot of people to grasp because they think, well, surely if I can take an AR-15 out of somebody's hands, well, then they can't use an AR-15 to commit a crime. It's not one-to-one like this. So let's take the Buffalo shooter, for example. The gun he purchased was not truly an AR-15. He purchased a gun that was compliant with the law under New York standards. New York has some pretty strict standards regarding semi-automatic rifles. He modified it. And so one of the things that ends up happening in these mass shooter circumstances, and one of the reasons why a lot of the gun control solutions don't even really reach them at all. There's a famous Glenn Kessler fact check from the 2016 election cycle where he noted that not a single one of the currently prevalent gun control measures or gun control proposals would have stopped a single serious mass shooting over the period of years evaluated. And so that's one of the reasons why, there's a disconnect is the thought that I believe this policy will do versus what this policy will actually do. There's often a disconnect there. And so I totally agree. I want our students to feel safe. I absolutely want that. I think that there are liberty interests in being able to go to school and not be worried that you might die. Absolutely. But the question that I have is, what is it that satisfies that liberty interest? And what is it that satisfies that liberty interest in a way that's meaningful and effective without also colliding unacceptably with other liberty interests? We deal with this in the crime situation all of the time. I mean, we have a lot of crime in this country, but we always apply due process. We have a lot of crime in this country, but we have an exclusionary rule that says that if the police gather evidence in a way that violates the constitutional rights of the criminal, that evidence is excluded, even if it means that a criminal may go back out on the street and do more harm. And so we have competing liberty interests, and safety. Safety is not the interest that trumps all other interests.
I would agree with that. I think the difference is if you are a child growing up in the United States today, your most likely cause of death is a gun. And that has never been the case before in this country.
Right. I mean,
and that is a material change in our society that I find absolutely abhorrent as a Christian. And
I think it's terrible.
And
I think it's terrible. I also don't think we should keep using the child language because that's just not accurate.
If you are 19 or under in this country, if you die in this country, the leading cause is going to be guns. And that I find utterly unacceptable. And it's unacceptable that we're unwilling to do something about it. Okay, last bit on this, because there's been a lot of attention.
Let me ask you this about it. Is the leading cause guns, or is it suicide plus crime? And so that's what I mean is the issue that I have is when we're talking about suicide, it's not a synonym for guns.
No, it's not. I just a few months ago attended a service for a young man at my kid's high school who took his own life with an automobile.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a significant mental health crisis happening among young people in this country. And when you combine that with the fact that there are so many guns available to them in their homes, or if they're above a certain age, able to purchase it's a terrifying reality of what we're facing. And I'm not arguing at all that we shouldn't care about mental health intervention and only take away guns. I am all in favor of, like I said, every possible means of creating a culture of life. I just don't support the idea that there's nothing you can do about guns. Just ignore it, move on, deal with other parts of this. I want to talk about the police dynamic in this, because a lot of attention has been given to what appears to be a pretty horrible failure on the part of the police that were at the school in Texas. And there was 70 some minutes before they actually went in and took down the shooter. You talked about this on your recent episode of Advisory Opinions on May 27th, and I had to stop, pause the thing because I had a hard time believing what I heard you say. And so I captured it, and I want to read back to you some of your statements about this. I don't disagree with anything you said. I just was surprised you said it. So here's what you said, and you were not giving a justification for the police not intervening, but you were trying to give some understanding as to why they didn't do it. This is what you said. One of the reasons why you so thoroughly train Marine infantry, airborne, cav troopers is that instinct to kick in that moment. In that ultimate moment when you're not acting from a higher brain function, you're acting on instinct. When I see someone point a rifle at me, when I see a tactical situation emerging, everything happens just instantaneously. I've seen this happen with my own eyes. To interrupt, for those who don't know, you are a Army veteran. You were in some hot spots in Iraq, so you have seen this up front. You continued, with a lot of our cops, that's just not there. And then you go on to mention somebody you talked to recently who had access to police training in a state and was surprised by how little training there actually was compared to, say, military officers or infantry. And then you continue. So I think what ends up happening sometimes in these extreme situations is instantaneously you have escalated beyond training and experience in any meaningful way, which is one of the reasons why a lot of times they will hit pause until they get somebody with training like the SWAT team or an emergency response team. That's not to say they should not. It's not to say they should hang back. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying they should go in, but that's not going to be the instinctive response when someone is leveling an AR-15 in your direction. It's not the way human beings work. You continue. Armies throughout history have developed a complex way of celebrating, affirming, and training for valor and punishing cowardice. And this is what some of our police training really lacks. We compare them to warriors, but we don't train them to be warriors. And in many ways, you don't want to train them to have a warrior mindset. And finally, you wrap up, that warrior mindset is what we don't train our police officers for. Okay.
Right.
Now, what surprised me about this is, I don't know when, but in the past, you have spoken about police shootings, the ones that get a lot of attention in the media. And you've talked about how we need to reform some of the training of our police and get rid of what feel like more military tactics, like no-knock warrants and things like that, which just put police in dangerous situations, put civilians in dangerous situations. But when I read or heard you say this, two things came to mind. One is, if our police are not trained to be soldiers, and we don't necessarily want them to be trained to be soldiers because policing requires a different set of skills on the streets of small town America than it does to be a soldier in Fallujah. But our police are finding themselves in situations that feel like warfare with military grade weaponry and body armor. I mean, in the shooting in Buffalo, there was an off-duty or a retired police officer who was working security. He shot multiple times the assailant, hit him multiple times, but it didn't take him down because of body armor. And that man was killed by the assailant. So they're facing what feels like war situations. They're not trained for it. So, okay, in my simple way of thinking, it feels like there's two solutions to that. One is either train police in military tactics, train police to be soldiers on the streets of America, or maybe we should change which weapons are floating in circulation so that maybe they're not facing military style or caliber weaponry and body armor in an elementary school. Am I oversimplifying this, or have I got it?
So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this kind of training is, so if you are, and this is something I've written about at length, we equip our police as if they are infantry.
Right.
But we don't train them like that. Okay?
Should we?
In certain contexts, yes. In certain contexts, no. So in the context where the answer is yes, so one of the things that infantry are trained towards is they're not trained towards self-preservation.
Right.
Okay. So they're trained against self-preservation. That whereas police are often, and one of the things I noted in that podcast is I was talking to a journalist who had just spent total immersion in police training, and the emphasis was on self-preservation. Okay. So what ends up happening is if you equip somebody with military grade weaponry and you train them towards self-preservation, you're lowering their tolerance for risk and you're upping their ability to deal out death. Now, what that ends up happening in a lot of situations across the United States is that means that people are too quick to pull the trigger. Police are too quick to pull the trigger. So they're trained towards self-preservation and equipped to take life. And so, for example, a classic example of this is the Philando Castile shooting in Minnesota, where you had a police officer who, by his own testimony, guys, he smelled weed, thought that meant that whoever was in the car had no regard for human life with a kid in the back, and knew the person had a gun because the person warned him that he had a gun, and he panicked and he shot him. Okay. That is something that would be extremely rare to see. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine. I saw our guys in Iraq exercise greater trigger discipline in Diyala province in the middle of a war zone than I've seen some cops exercise in the United States when we're at peace. And so one of the issues that we have is, in the best sense of the term warrior, we're not actually training people in that way. In the best sense of that, you're trained to ignore the self-preservation instinct and to pursue the preservation and the safety of others. So, and you can show somebody a PowerPoint to that effect. And there's some training, for example, that the New York Times uncovered, where it says the Uvalde police were trained, quote unquote, trained to go pursue the shooter no matter what. Well, they were taught to. They weren't trained. They weren't trained in the sense that as soon as something happens, that instinct kicks in and you do what you're trained to do. They were taught. They were showed some slides. They went through a couple of exercises. That's not training in any meaningful sense. And so the point is that if you want people to disregard their self-preservation instinct and to pursue a shooter, you can't just sort of sit there and say, well, I hope this school resource officer is an extraordinary human being. You have to train them for the circumstance you hire them for, right?
Right. And you articulated in this part of the podcast, I mean, here's another part of the quote. When you're going to see somebody with an AR-15, much less somebody with an AR-15 who levels it at them and shoots, all of a sudden you have immediately escalated beyond their training, meaning beyond the police officer's training and experience, immediately, instantaneously. And that has unpredictable results in people. Like, do we want an America in which our police officers are having to be trained in these kinds of tactics because of what we have flooded our streets with?
No, we don't. We don't.
I mean, police officers have to do a lot more than face deadly shooters every day. Most of them don't. They're facing domestic violence disputes and drug abuse problems and mental health issues and, just ordinary,
But if you're going to have a school resource officer, and the reason they're there, okay, so why do we have these guys? As a general rule, what ends up happening, and one of the reasons why the school, I was a part of a school board and we decided not to have a school resource officer, was that the chances of a school shooting were infinitesimally small. The chances that having a school resource officer meant criminalization of routine misconduct at school was 100%. In theory, the reason you have a school resource officer is to react to a worst case scenario. So if the purpose of the school resource officer is to react to the worst case scenario and not to shake down students for a bag of weed, right? Or to book people for assault if they get into a fight in the hallway. If the purpose for a school resource officer is for worst case scenario safety, that's what they should train for a lot. Okay. That should be the focus of their training. Instead, what you have are people who have in what might be among the most boring jobs you can imagine in many ways. And then all of a sudden, 1 out of 100,000 of them, or 1 out of 10,000 or whatever, will have that moment of sheer unbelievable shock and terror, and they're not equipped for it. And we saw it at Parkland. We saw it at Uvalde. And so that's why, my argument is, you're going to get what you trained for unless somebody is an extremely rare human being.
And I agree. What gives me pause and grieves me is it sounds like what you're saying is we've come to a place in America where we need tactically trained, essentially soldiers equipped in our schools to prevent our children from being killed. Or statistically speaking, don't put anyone there because it's pretty pointless.
No, it's one. We've come to the point where that is one of the measures that is among a menu of measures that should be utilized, and it's inadequate, I think, for somebody to say, like a politician to say, well, what we need is the good guy with the gun, and that takes care of the problem. Because obviously we've seen that it doesn't, right?
Right. I mean, that's a good point. And that was the famous line that came out of Wayne LaPierre after the Sandy Hook shooting. And now we have multiple examples where there were good guys with guns. There was a
And
good
they
guy
didn't
with
do
a
their.
gun in Buffalo at the supermarket. There were
Yep.
multiple good guys with guns in Uvalde. And 3 of them went in relatively early and were grazed by bullets when they were shot through the door. So the idea that if we just have good guys with guns, bad guys won't do bad things or they'll be stopped immediately isn't true. So
It's
what I'm
false. Yeah.
hearing now is we don't just need good guys with guns. We need military trained good guys with guns.
Well, you need to train people to. You need to train people to deal with the threat you hire them for, right?
But the
And
fact
so if
that the
that's
threat is there is what is
yeah, I
so
know, Skye. I know, Skye. But nothing that you've proposed that I've opposed would deal with that.
I think it would. If you had to go
Why?
through
What's your evidence for saying that?
Well, the problem is it's never been tried. Like we have never tried a model in which to get, for the example, this 18-year-old before he could buy those weapons, he should have had to have gone through a course and had a mental evaluation. That probably would have prevented him from getting weapons. But you're saying
Um,
that's an infringement of his constitutional rights because there's no due process.
what I'm saying is the measure I would have proposed would have would have denied him the access to the weapon without putting fundamental rights at the subjective assessment of goodness knows who.
But Texas Texas as a whole is opposed to your proposal as well because they don't believe in red flag laws.
Well, but your less realistic proposal isn't going to then therefore become law if my more realistic proposal has barriers.
If your proposal is brought up, I will 100% support it because I think it's a big step in the right direction. I'm not opposing that at all. I would just take it even further.
Right. And we'll just have to agree to disagree on that. I'm absolutely 100% never going to consent to a subjective psych evaluation by God knows who to have the ability to defend my family from white nationalists who threaten our lives.
Last question then. In countries that do have much more stringent barriers to accessing firearms, to purchasing them, prerequisites, whether it's a psych evaluation, I don't know if anybody does that, or just significant barriers, do you believe that those countries are violating their citizens' basic human rights?
No, because I think the issue you have, if you're talking about a fundamental right of self-defense, is a fundamental right of self-defense against foreseeable threats. Okay, so if a foreseeable threat in a nation where there are very few guns in circulation is very, very different from a foreseeable threat in a country where there are a lot of guns in circulation, and so in that circumstance, I think what you have is the fundamental right is a right to effective self-defense. It isn't.
So,
It isn't to. So, for example, if I think the most foreseeable threat to me is an individual with a semi-automatic rifle or semi-automatic pistol, I don't then think, well, I have to really trump the guy, I have a right to bazooka, or to really trump the guy, I have a right to fully automatic machine gun. But I have a right to deal with foreseeable threats that I am most likely to experience.
So we could probably agree, even statistically verify what are foreseeable threats in the United States in 2022. Why not stop all gun manufacturing and sales in America so that by 2050 or 2060, there are just fewer guns, which means the foreseeable threat is less likely to be many of these guns because they'll eventually fall out of circulation with age. Why not just
Stop
stop
them.
stop making more guns?
Stop making more guns entirely.
Just
so
ban
that
the sale of guns going forward so that you have 400 million already and you can continue to circulate and sell those. But why do we need more?
The problem you have then is, so when somebody comes of age and they're perfectly law-abiding citizen, then what you're saying is that you're placing in front of them an incredible barrier to the exercise of their rights of self-defense, that is going to enhance the personal danger that they face, that's going to inhibit their ability to defend against foreseeable threats, and sort of the hope that the 400 million guns sort of tails off over a very long time. And the fact of the matter is, guns are used defensively in this country all the time to save lives. And so my issue here is, time and time again, what we're talking about is the regulation of the gun that is used overwhelmingly lawfully by tens and tens of millions of Americans, when that is not proven to deal with the kinds of threats that we are facing, and other measures are more effective.
And I would agree with you, David. For example, and this, we got to wrap up because I know we both have to go. I have no problem with you owning guns. As far as I know you, you're obviously trained. You're a veteran. You know how to use them. As far as I can tell, you seem mentally stable. I'm not worried about you committing a crime.
Some question that on Twitter.
Right. I'm not worried about you committing a crime. I assume you're responsible enough with your weapons that they're not going to fall into the hands of a child or someone who shouldn't be operating them or using them. So do I think the government should step in and tell David French, you can't have a gun? No, I don't. But an 18-year-old who's exhibited mental instability and has broadcast, like you said, their intentions to harm themselves or others, I think we should have a lot more barriers for someone like that to get access to a weapon. And the details of what that looks like, maybe you and I disagree with it. I would probably, put more barriers in place than you would, or more preemptive barriers than you would. But I think we can agree that the status quo is unacceptable in this country.
I think the fact that if somebody's exhibiting behavior that indicates they're a threat to themselves and others, and school officials, parents, police officers have zero to few tools to deal with that, is a massive problem. And it's one that is directly tied to the emergency that we've been talking about, which is mass shootings. Again, going back to the Institute for Justice funded study, in the majority of cases, the person broadcast leaked their plans. And so in that circumstance, if you have a legal remedy that is tailored to that problem we're talking about, I think it makes all the, and in fact, just last year, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio joined Angus King and, I'm forgetting the Democratic senator, to propose a national red flag incentive program from the Department of Justice. I think this makes so much sense, and it doesn't do anything to impact the ability of a law-abiding, responsible person to defend themselves. It does not touch that. It touches those people who engage in threatening and menacing behavior. And so, to me, it makes all the sense in the world.
I agree. It does make all the sense of the world. And the fact that there are so many Americans and, frankly, Christians who oppose even that is shocking to me and a point of grief. David, thank you for willing to engage in sometimes a contentious conversation. I always learn more. I always learn more from your point of view. I deeply respect the thinking and maturity that you bring to it, and it sharpens me. I'm hoping it sharpens our audience as well. So I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, this was fun. Enjoyed it.
French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of the Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.